The chokehold around my throat never finished closing. That's the part people don't believe when I tell them. They expect me to say I froze, or begged, or went limp the way every article about controlling husbands says a bride is supposed to. Instead, 3 days after I said I do, with my father watching from the front row, I caught my husband's hand at my throat and bent 2 of his fingers back until they snapped. Corbin Hewitt was 30 years old, a regional sales rep for an industrial water treatment company, and he had promised to love me in front of 47 people on a Saturday afternoon. By Tuesday evening, he had me pinned against the kitchen counter of our Charleston rental, with his wedding ring pressing into my collarbone, and his mouth close enough that I could smell the bourbon he said he'd stopped drinking. "You belong to me now." That was the last sentence he said with both hands working. My name is Bellamy Prescott. I was 28, a high school PE teacher with calloused palms and my father's steady gaze, and when my husband's fingers tightened, I did not freeze. I did not scream. I did not do what every article about domestic violence tells you a woman is supposed to do. My left hand came up and trapped his wrist against my neck. My right hand rotated his grip counterclockwise until his palm faced the ceiling. Then I hooked my thumb under his index and middle fingers and hyperextended both until the joints gave way with a sound like someone stepping on a walnut. He dropped. The scream that came out of him was high and thin, and nothing like the voice that had read his vows. I stepped sideways, picked up my phone from the counter, and dialed 911 with hands that were perfectly steady. The 911 operator asked me to please stay on the line. I stayed on the line. I watched Corbin curl around his broken fingers on the tile floor under the fluorescent kitchen light, and I tasted copper in the back of my throat, and I waited. They expect me to tell you I was terrified. I wasn't. I was vibrating. Everything in me was still switched on and had nowhere left to go, like an engine revving after the car has already stopped. The fear came later, in waves, over weeks. But in that kitchen, standing over the man I had married 72 hours earlier, what I felt was something closer to recognition. My hands had known what to do before my brain caught up, and that meant someone had put the knowledge there. To understand why, you need to go back 20 years to a dojo that smelled like rubber mats and tiger balm. Knox Prescott, my father, was 57 years old and had run a small martial arts studio off Rivers Avenue in North Charleston for 22 years. He never raised his voice above a conversation. He never hit a heavy bag when he was angry. He was the kind of man who believed discipline was a form of patience, and patience was a form of love, and love was the thing you practiced when nobody was watching. I was 8 the first time he put me on the mat. It was a Saturday morning in 2003. The other kids on our block were riding bikes. I was learning how to trap a wrist and rotate a grip and use leverage instead of strength to put someone twice my size on the floor. "Why doesn't Tyler have to do this?" I asked about my older brother. My father knelt beside me on the padded mat, adjusted my thumb placement, and said, "Your brother's a boy walking through the world. You're a girl walking through it. Different world, same feet. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that the world she's walking into has teeth without scaring her out of walking at all? You don't explain it. You just teach her what her hands can do, and you hope she never has to find out why." He never called it self-defense. He called it just in case, the way you'd call a fire extinguisher just in case, something you buy hoping the house never burns. Every Saturday for 20 years. The same drills, the same corrections, the same quiet voice saying again, until the movements lived in my muscle memory like a second language I didn't know I spoke. I thought it was a game. He never corrected me. He just kept teaching, kept adjusting my grip, kept saying, "Different world, same feet," whenever I asked why it mattered. He watched me grow up and graduate and get a teaching degree and fall in love with a man whose smile worked like a lockpick, and he said almost nothing. Almost. I didn't understand what my father was building inside me, one Saturday session at a time, for 2 decades. I didn't understand what different world, same feet actually meant. Not until I was 28 years old, 3 days married, standing in my own kitchen with the taste of adrenaline on my tongue and two of my husband's fingers bent the wrong way, and a 911 operator asking me to please stay on the line. The aftermath is the part that actually matters. The grip is just where the story starts, but the grip is where everyone wants to start, and the story doesn't live there. The story lives in the 8 months before it, when I walked willingly toward the man whose hand would find my throat and smiled the entire way. I met Corbin at a regional education conference in Charleston on a Tuesday in November. The coffee was terrible. The keynote was worse. His company had a vendor booth near the back wall selling water filtration systems to school districts, and he was leaning against it with his sleeves rolled up when I walked past, looking for a power outlet. He remembered my name before I finished saying it. He asked what I taught, and when I said PE, he didn't make the joke everyone makes. He asked what sport I'd played in college. He asked it like the answer mattered. Within a week, he was texting me, "Good morning every day." Not the lazy kind with an emoji, full sentences, specific. "Hope the 6th graders don't destroy you today. You mentioned they're the worst on Wednesdays." He remembered details I'd said once, in passing, while I was looking at my phone. He remembered the waiter's name at every restaurant. He remembered my coffee order after hearing it a single time. I didn't have a word yet for someone who collects details about you like inventory. I want to be honest about something. I wasn't naive. I was tired. There's a difference, and it matters. I'd had 2 relationships before Corbin. One lasted 14 months and ended because neither of us could be bothered to plan a weekend. The other lasted 9 months and ended because he forgot my birthday and didn't care that he forgot it. After 2 men who couldn't plan further than Friday, here was someone who had February penciled in by December. He booked restaurants a week out. He sent calendar invites for dates. My friends called him a catch. 2 of them said it on the same day, unprompted, like they'd compared notes. By January, he was meeting me after work with takeout in the parking lot. By February, I brought him to dinner at my father's house in North Charleston. My father read people the way he read a sparring partner, not by what they showed you, but by what they were protecting. Knox shook Corbin's hand in the doorway and held it a beat too long, studying him the way he studied a new student's stance on the first day. Corbin smiled through it. He complimented the house. He asked about the dojo. He was perfect, and my father watched him be perfect the way you watch a cloud that's the wrong color. Dinner was roasted chicken and potatoes. Corbin told 3 stories about himself. All of them ended with him winning something: a sales award, a client, a half marathon he'd trained for in 6 weeks. Knox listened with his fork resting on the edge of his plate and said nothing until dessert was cleared. Afterward, I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink. Steam from the hot water fogged the window. Knox came in with the serving bowl and set it on the counter beside me. He didn't look at me. He looked at the window. "He talks about himself like he's already won something," he said quietly. "Watch how he reacts when someone tells him no." I dried my hands on the towel and turned to face him. Knox put his hand on my shoulder the way he did when I was small, warm and steady, and I shrugged it off because I was 28 and I'd earned the right to choose. "Dad, he plans dates 3 weeks out. He texts me good morning every single day. You're reading something that isn't there." How do you argue with a feeling someone else has about a person who has only ever been good to you? You don't argue with it. You file it away as overprotection, the kind fathers trade in when their daughters bring home a man who isn't afraid of them. I told myself Knox was being the version of himself I'd outgrown the man who taught an 8-year-old joint locks because the world had teeth. I told myself I was too old to need that kind of thinking. Knox said it once. He didn't repeat it. He didn't bring it up again at the engagement dinner or the bridal shower or the morning of the wedding. That was how he operated. He said the thing one time, quietly, like he expected you to carry it yourself. And I let it drop on the kitchen floor with the dish soap and the steam and the sound of Corbin laughing in the other room. I'd had 2 relationships that died of boredom, and one father who saw something in a handshake that I couldn't find in 8 months of being adored. I didn't have a frame of reference for what Knox was warning me about. Not because the signs weren't there, but because the man who would pin me against a counter by my throat had spent every day since November making sure I'd never think to look for them. The signs were there. They were disguised as romance, which is the only disguise that works every time. The wedding was small and perfect in every way that would make the ending worse. 60 guests on a rented lawn near Folly Beach, string lights strung between live oaks, salt air, blowing the programs off the chairs. A photographer who kept telling us to kiss one more time for the light. Corbin cried during his vows. He held my face in both hands like I was something he couldn't believe he got to keep. And every person in those white folding chairs believed him. I believed him. If you watch the video, and I still have it, I haven't been able to delete it, you'd see a man who meant every word, probably, in whatever limited way he was capable of meaning things. My father sat in the second row and clapped when everyone else clapped. He didn't cry. He didn't toast at the reception. He watched. He shook Corbin's hand at the end of the night and said, "Take care of her." And Corbin said, "That's the plan." And Knox let go of his hand and walked to his car without turning around. I know what you're thinking. You'd have seen it. Everybody thinks they'd see it. You'd have caught the way his vows sounded more like a closing argument than a promise. You'd have noticed that he cried at the exact moment the photographer repositioned. You'd have felt something wrong in the air the way my father did. But you weren't there. You were never the woman in the dress being looked at like she was the center of a world someone had built specifically to hold her. That's the trick. The world he built was beautiful. It just wasn't built for me to leave. We spent the night at a hotel on Folly Beach and drove to the rental house the next morning. Day 1 of the marriage. Boxes in the hallway, packing tape on the kitchen counter, a new set of towels his mother had sent that were nicer than anything I'd ever owned. Corbin made coffee while I unpacked the bedroom. Then he sat down at the kitchen table in a gray t-shirt with a bowl of cereal and started talking about what he called shared living rules. A joint calendar, so we'd always know where the other person was. Shared phone passwords for transparency, so neither of us ever has to wonder. One set of house keys that he'd keep track of because he was better with logistics. A single checking account for household expenses, funded from both salaries, managed by him because he had the spreadsheet already built. A single rule is a suggestion. 2 rules are a system. 3 rules are a fence, and you're standing inside it before you notice the gate is behind you. Each one sounded reasonable on its own. A marriage counselor might have endorsed any of them individually. But he wasn't proposing them as conversations. He was listing them, one after another, in the same calm voice he used when he pitched filtration contracts to school boards. There was no pause for my input. There was no, "What do you think?" There was a plan, and my role in the plan was to agree with it. I laughed. I said, "Do we need a 3-ring binder for our first week of marriage?" He looked at me, not angry, not offended, something flatter than that the way you'd look at a colleague who made a joke during a presentation that wasn't on the agenda. Something behind his eyes went still, like a door closing in a room I hadn't been invited into. We'd been married for 26 hours. I didn't laugh. He set his spoon on the edge of the cereal bowl carefully, precisely, the way he did everything, and kept talking. The joint checking account would need both our direct deposits redirected by Friday. He'd already drafted the change of address forms. He'd handle the utilities because he had a system. I sat across from him with my coffee going cold and told myself that some people are just planners. Some people show love through logistics. After 2 relationships that couldn't survive a weekend without someone forgetting to call, here was a man with a spreadsheet. I told myself that not finding my joke funny didn't mean anything. Some people just don't laugh at the same things. That was the first lie I told myself as a married woman. It wouldn't be the last, but it was the one that mattered most, because it was the one that taught me how to do it. You start with something small. He's just organized. He's just thorough. He's just not a joke person, and each small lie makes the next one easier, the way a muscle loosens with repetition. By the time you need to lie to yourself about something that actually matters, you're already trained. I finished my coffee. I signed up for the joint calendar. I gave him my phone password, and when he handed me a single house key and kept the spare on his own ring, I told myself it was practical. The boxes were still stacked in the hallway. The towels from his mother were still in their plastic, and the man across the table was still smiling, but the smile had changed just slightly, just enough into the expression of someone who'd gotten what he came for. What he'd gotten was compliance, and compliance, I'd learn, was only the appetizer. The next evening, I drove to my father's dojo the way I had every Monday and Thursday for 3 years, and I didn't check the parking lot because I had no reason to. The class was 8 women, ages 22 to 51, and we worked joint locks on the blue mats under fluorescent lights that buzzed when the air conditioning kicked on. I showed a new student how to break a wrist grip the same hold Knox taught me at 8, the one I could do in my sleep. I adjusted her thumb angle the way my father had adjusted mine, and I said, again, in the same quiet tone. And for an hour and 15 minutes, I was the version of myself that existed before Corbin. The dojo smelled like rubber mats and tiger balm. The sound of bare feet on padding and the slap of a drill landing right filled the room like a heartbeat. This was the one place that was mine before him and would be mine after. I just didn't know there'd be an after so soon. Knox was in the back office when I finished. He nodded at me through the doorway without saying anything. That was how he told you he was proud, with silence and a nod, the same way he'd been telling me since I was small enough to stand on his shoes. I didn't know that a silver sedan had been parked across the lot for the entire class. I didn't know someone had watched me through the glass door for 75 minutes, studying the way I moved, cataloging the women I taught, noting the time I started and the time I finished. I wouldn't learn that for another 12 days. But the car was there, and the man inside it was the same man who'd cried during his vows 2 days earlier. I want to be honest about something. When what came next came, I almost gave in. That instinct, the one worn smooth by every woman who's ever kept the peace to keep a man comfortable, it was right there, ready. It would have been so easy to say yes, to fold, to call it compromise and move on. I need you to know how close I came, because the part where I didn't fold is the part that changed everything. Day 3. Evening. I came home from school to find Corbin at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of him. He'd made a weekly schedule, not suggested one, made one. It was printed from his laptop, color-coded in the same neat format he used for his sales territory maps. Monday through Sunday, hour by hour. My Monday and Thursday evenings, the dojo had been replaced with a blue block labeled Family Time. He'd printed it, color-coded. We'd been married for 72 hours. I was thinking about our schedule, he said, sliding the paper toward me. We just got married. We should be spending our evenings together, not across town. The class can wait until things settle. The paper was still warm from the printer. I picked it up and read it, and I felt my mouth go dry the way it does when your body understands something before your brain has the words for it. Every evening was accounted for. Every block had a label. My name appeared in the schedule the way a resource appears in a project plan, allocated, assigned, managed. Corbin, I teach those classes. That's my work. It's volunteer work. It's not your job. It's my decision. He picked up his coffee mug and set it back down on the counter harder than he needed to. Not a slam, just enough force to make the sound land like a period at the end of a sentence. I'm not telling you what to do, he said. I'm asking you to prioritize us. That's what married people do. When someone tells you not to make something a thing, whose thing are they really protecting? Not yours. Never yours. They're protecting the version of the conversation where they win without having to say what they're actually asking for, which is, obedience dressed in the language of partnership. You don't get to decide my schedule and then frame it as a conversation, I said. I'm teaching Monday and Thursday. That's not changing. The kitchen went quiet. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that has weight. The kind that presses against your eardrums like a change in altitude. Corbin looked at me and his face did something I'd never seen before. It didn't change expression so much as lose one, the way a screen goes blank when the power cuts. Don't turn this into a thing, he said, flat. Final, like a lock engaging in a door I didn't know existed. The words weren't loud. They weren't angry. They were rehearsed, worn smooth by use. A sentence designed to end a conversation before it became accountability. I didn't know yet that another woman had heard that exact phrase from that exact mouth, in that exact tone, and that it had ended the same way. I just knew that the man standing across the kitchen from me wasn't the same man who'd held my face in both hands 2 days ago and wept. The coffee was going cold. The printed schedule sat between us on the counter, and something in the room had shifted from a disagreement between two married people into something I didn't have a name for yet, but my body already recognized. He moved faster than I'd ever seen a person move outside my father's dojo. 1 second, he was at the counter with his coffee. The next, he was across the kitchen with his hand around my throat and my back against the counter edge, and the printed schedule was on the floor between us. His fingers tightened all at once, like he'd practiced. His face was close enough that I could see the vein in his temple and the coffee on his lower lip. You belong to me now. I didn't decide to fight back. I need you to understand that. There was no moment where I weighed options or thought about what Knox would do. There was no decision. There was just his grip compressing my airway, and then 20 years of Saturday morning drills answering a question. My muscles had been trained to resolve before my brain could interfere. My left hand trapped his wrist against my collarbone. My right hand found the angle and rotated outward until his palm faced the ceiling. Then I hooked his 2 smallest working fingers and pulled them past where the joints were designed to stop. The sound was sharper than I remembered from drills. Wetter. 2 small pops in fast succession, and his grip vanished like someone cut the power to his arm. He went down to the tile, making a noise I'd never heard a human being make, high and thin, and nothing like the voice that had read those vows. I stepped sideways. The coffee pot was still on. His blood was on the tile before we'd hung a single picture on the walls. 4 seconds. That's how long it took to end an 8-month courtship, a marriage that hadn't lasted a full work week, and every version of the future I'd imagined when I said yes. I picked up my phone. The screen was cracked from hitting the counter edge when he pushed me, but it worked. I dialed 911, and the operator answered on the second ring, and my voice came out steady. Not calm. Steady. Calm is when the danger is over. Steady is when your body is still ready for more, and you're telling it there isn't any. My husband assaulted me. I defended myself. He has 2 broken fingers. We need police and medical. I gave the address. I stayed on the line. I looked at the man curled on the floor, cradling his hand against his chest, and I tried to feel something specific. Anger, grief, vindication. And what I felt instead was a flatness so total it scared me more than his hand on my throat had. I felt like I was watching someone else's kitchen, someone else's marriage, someone else's Tuesday evening that was supposed to include a self-defense class and a drive home with the windows down. The patrol car pulled up 7 minutes later. I know because I watched the microwave clock the way you watch a clock in a waiting room, not because time matters, but because counting is something to do when your hands won't stop shaking. 2 officers came through the front door. A male officer went to Corbin. A female officer, younger than me with latex gloves already on, came to me. "Can I see your neck?" she asked. The bruises were already surfacing. She photographed them without asking permission, which told me she'd done this before and knew marks could fade before a court date. She was efficient and gentle, and she didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "Are you okay?" She just documented. I was grateful for that. They took his statement in the living room. I heard him through the wall. I reached for her, like reaching was a neutral act, like a hand around a throat was a gesture that could be explained away with the right verb. The officer asked if he wanted medical attention for his hand. He said yes. They put handcuffs on him in the hallway. I heard the click from the kitchen. He didn't look at me as they walked him out. He looked at his hand, at the 2 fingers swelling dark and bending wrong like it had betrayed him. Not like he'd used it to try to choke his wife. Like the failure of the grip was the problem, not the grip itself. The cruiser's lights painted red and blue across the living room wall, and then the engine pulled away, and the house went quiet. I stood at the kitchen sink and ran cold water over my wrists because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. They were still shaking, not from fear, not from regret, from the fact that every nerve in my body was still firing at full alert with no target left. The coffee pot was still on. The schedule was still on the floor. We'd been married 3 days, and I was alone in a kitchen that smelled like copper and dish soap, listening to silence fill every room he'd just been carried out of. I cleaned the blood off the tile before I called my father. I got on my knees with a sponge and a bottle of bleach, and I scrubbed until the grout was white again, because I didn't want it there when I tried to explain what had happened in the kitchen where we were supposed to start a life. The bleach burned my knuckles. I didn't care. There was something in the act of cleaning that felt like the only control I had left. The floor could be fixed, the stain could be erased, and if I worked hard enough, the room could look like nothing had happened in it. I wrung the sponge into the sink and watched pink water spiral down the drain, and then I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand and called Knox. He picked up on the first ring. I told him everything. He didn't interrupt. He didn't gasp or swear or ask me to repeat anything. He just listened the way he'd always listened completely, without performing a reaction, the way he stood at the edge of the mat and watched you drill until you got it right. When I finished, he asked one question. "Are you okay?" What do you call the feeling after the adrenaline leaves, but before the grief arrives? I didn't have a name for it then. I opened my mouth to say yes, and nothing came out. Not because I was hurt, because I genuinely didn't know what I was. I was a woman who'd been married for 3 days and had broken her husband's fingers on her own kitchen floor and felt nothing about it that resembled any emotion I'd been taught to expect. "I don't know," I said. He told me he was getting in the car. I told him no, not tonight. I needed to sit in the quiet and figure out what it sounded like when it wasn't someone else's silence holding me in place. He didn't argue. He said, "Call me in the morning. I mean it." I said I would. I meant it too. I slept on the couch that night. Not because the bedroom reminded me of Corbin, it didn't. Not yet. But because the couch was close to the front door, and my body still wanted an exit within reach. I slept with my shoes on. I didn't realize I'd done that until the next morning when I woke up with my sneakers still tied and the sun coming through the blinds at an angle that told me I'd slept past 7. Day 4. I drank bitter coffee standing at the counter and called a colleague at the school who'd been through a custody fight 2 years earlier. She gave me a name without hesitation, the way women pass along that kind of information quickly, precisely, like handing someone a fire extinguisher. I want to tell you, I walked into that office feeling strong. The truth is, I walked in feeling like a woman who'd been married for 3 days and had already failed at it, even though I knew that wasn't what had happened. Failure is a feeling that doesn't need facts. It just needs shame, and shame was already sitting in my chest, like something I'd swallowed wrong. Imogen Greer was 42 years old, a family law attorney whose office on King Street smelled like leather binders and old coffee. Her waiting room had 3 other women in it when I walked in. None of us looked at each other. We all knew why we were there, and knowing was enough. She sat me down in a hard wooden chair across from her desk, and I told the story a second time. It was easier the second time, which bothered me. She read the arrest report I'd brought, the one the female officer had given me a copy of, and she read it the way my father read a sparring stance. Not for what was there, but for what was missing. "This will be fine," she said, setting the report down. "I promise you that. We'll file an emergency protective order today. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to think before you answer." She pushed her reading glasses down her nose and looked at me directly. "Is there anything else? Anything before this? Any incident? Any conversation? Any moment where he scared you that you might not have thought was connected?" I said no. There was nothing before the kitchen. The 8 months before it had been restaurants and morning texts, and a man who remembered every detail I mentioned. She wrote that down on her legal pad, the pen scratching loud in the quiet office. Then she looked at me over those glasses, pen still resting on the page, and said something I wouldn't fully understand for another week. "Sometimes there's something before this that happened to someone else." I didn't know what she meant, but she did. The way she said it carefully, without alarm, like a doctor who's seen the same lab result enough times to know what comes next. Told me she'd been in this exact chair, across from this exact kind of story. Enough times to know that men like Corbin rarely start with the woman who finally fights back. I left Imogen's office that afternoon with her question sitting in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow. Someone else. She'd said it like she already knew. I didn't, not yet. But before that question could go anywhere, there was paperwork. Imogen filed the emergency protective order before lunch on day 4, and for about 19 hours, I made the mistake of thinking the hard part was over. The Charleston County Courthouse smelled like floor wax and recycled air. Imogen walked me through every page like she was teaching a class. Sign here, initial here. This paragraph is where the court agrees to listen to you. I'd never thought of paperwork as something that could keep you safe, but she treated it like a weapon, quiet, precise, impossible to argue with once it was stamped. The clerk behind the counter was a woman in her 50s who didn't look up when she took the forms. She pressed the stamp down with the flat of her palm, a mechanical thud that echoed off the marble floor, and slid the receipt across the counter. "Hearing set within 10 days, she said. 10 days. 10 days until someone in a robe would decide whether I deserved to feel safe in a house I was paying rent on. I want you to understand what it feels like to sign your name on a form, asking the state to protect you from the person who promised to protect you less than a week ago. It feels like filling out a permission slip to exist in your own life. It feels bureaucratic and surreal and absolutely necessary, all at the same time." Walking out of that courthouse with the stamped copy in my hand, I felt something I hadn't felt since the kitchen, not relief, not safety, but the sense that I was doing something instead of having something done to me. That feeling lasted until the next afternoon. Day 5. I came back to the rental house after a half day at school. My principal had given me the week, but I went in anyway because sitting alone in that kitchen was worse than teaching, and there was an envelope tucked behind the screen door. Legal-sized, no postage, hand-delivered. I opened it standing on the porch with my keys still in my hand. I read it twice because the first time I was certain I'd misunderstood. Corbin had filed a protective order against me. He'd posted bail on day 4, the same day I was at the courthouse filing mine, and his attorney had walked the paperwork over before the ink was dry on my filing. The petition described an unprovoked attack by a spouse with martial arts training, who had caused serious bodily harm during a verbal disagreement. It described 2 broken fingers. It described a man who feared for his safety in his own home. Unprovoked, that was the word he chose. Like his hand around my throat was whether something that just happened, with no one standing behind it. I sat down on the porch step with the paper in my lap and read it a 3rd time. The language was clean and professional, and it painted a picture of a man who'd come home from work, had a conversation with his wife about scheduling, and been attacked without warning by someone trained in joint manipulation. There was no mention of his hand on my neck. No mention of the bruises the officer had photographed. No mention of the word he'd said, the one about belonging before my body did what my father had spent 2 decades putting into it. How do you prove someone was choking you when the only visible injury is on his hand? That's the question I sat with on my own porch in the July heat, holding a document that called me the danger. The steering wheel of my car was hot when I got in. The air inside was thick and still. I called Imogen from the driver's seat with the engine idling and read her the filing word by word. She wasn't surprised. That bothered me more than the filing itself. It's standard, she said. Not standard as in normal. Standard as in predictable. He's not trying to win the counter-petition. He's trying to muddy the water so the judge sees 2 people pointing at each other instead of 1 person with bruises on her throat. So what do? We document everything. We build a timeline the court can't argue with, and we don't react the way he wants us to react. I hung up and sat in the car with the engine running and the air conditioning blowing against my face, and I understood something I hadn't grasped until that moment. The assault in the kitchen wasn't the fight. That was just the match that lit it. The real fight was going to happen on paper, in courtrooms, in the gap between his version and mine. And right now, on paper, the man who had pinned me against a counter by my throat was the one with the documented injury and the sympathetic narrative and the attorney who'd gotten there first. He was turning himself into the victim. And the system, at least for now, was built to let him try. Winning on paper doesn't mean winning, but it buys time, and time was the thing I was running out of. The hearing was set. The counter petition was filed, and then his parents called. Day 6. The phone lit up on the couch cushion with a Somerville area code. Vaughn Hewitt spoke first, 62 years old, a retired commercial insurance underwriter who talked to me in the measured tone of a man accustomed to assessing liability rather than feeling it. He said he and Lorraine wanted to understand what had happened. He said the word understand 3 times in the first 2 minutes, and each time it meant something different, and none of them meant what it was supposed to. Then Lorraine got on the line. She was in her early 60s, a former church office administrator whose sympathy arrived prepackaged with explanations. You know how he gets, she said, like temper was a weather system, something you tracked and dressed for, not something a grown man chose to inflict on his wife. Vaughn came back and said, Every marriage has a rough patch. I held the phone away from my ear and stared at the ceiling and wanted to say, A rough patch is burned dinner and a slammed door. A rough patch is not your son's hand around my throat before we'd unpacked the wedding gifts. Let me tell you what gaslighting sounds like when it comes from people who've been doing it long enough to sound reasonable. It sounds like concern. It sounds like 2 people on speakerphone who care deeply and just want everyone to calm down and think clearly. They said the word overreacting without ever using the word overreacting. That's a skill. It takes practice. And sitting on my couch with cold, reheated coffee untouched on the table, I realized they'd had practice. This wasn't the first time they'd made this call. The words were too smooth. The pivot from sympathy to excuse was too rehearsed. Somewhere in the back of their careful voices was the sound of a script they'd run before. I hung up without agreeing to anything. I didn't call back. I sat in the house that still smelled faintly of bleach and thought about a question Imogen had asked 2 days earlier about whether something had happened before this to someone else. The Hewitts' polished concern was starting to sound like an answer. 2 days later, I got the confirmation. Day 8. Imogen called and asked me to come to her office. Not urgency in her voice efficiency. The kind of tone that meant she'd found something and wanted to show it rather than explain it over the phone. I drove to King Street and sat in the same hard chair, and she slid a printout across the desk, 16 months before our wedding. Someone else had sat across from a similar desk, filling out a similar form about the same man. A domestic complaint filed against Corbin in the county system. sparse on details the way these things often are when they're filed quickly and without an attorney but clear enough. A woman had accused him. The complaint had been filed, and then, 6 weeks later, it had been withdrawn. I ran his name through county records as standard procedure. Imogen said. This is what came back. She tapped the highlighted date with her pen. I stared at it and did the math without meaning to. While Corbin was texting me good morning every day, while he was remembering my coffee order and booking restaurants a week out, and holding my face in both hands like I was precious. Another woman had walked into a courthouse and told someone what he'd done, and then she'd taken it back. This isn't his first time, Imogen said. Flat, no drama. Like confirming a forecast she'd already predicted the day she asked me about someone else. Why does a woman file a complaint and then withdraw it? There are only two kinds of answers to that question, and neither of them is because she was wrong. Either she was scared into silence, or she was paid into it, or she was pressured by people who sounded just like the two voices I'd heard on my phone 2 days ago, saying, "You know how he gets," in a tone so practiced it could have been set to music. Who is she? I asked. The filing only has a first initial and last name. I'm working on it, but the question isn't just who she is. Imogen leaned forward, glasses low on her nose. The same look she'd given me the first day when she'd read the arrest report like a sparring stance. The question is, why she stopped talking. I sat in that chair and felt two things at once. The first was vindication, cold and clean, like ice water on a burn. I wasn't the first. He had a pattern, and patterns are harder to dismiss than incidents. The second feeling was worse. It was dread. Because somewhere out there was a woman who'd tried to do what I was doing, and she'd stopped. Something or someone had made her stop. And if I was going to win the hearing in 4 days, I needed to find out what. I needed to find out what had silenced her. But before I could look forward, my father pulled me backward to a detail he'd been carrying for 6 days like a stone in his pocket. My father waited until day 9 to tell me, and when he didn't start with what he saw. He started with an apology for not saying it sooner. We were standing on the dojo mat after hours, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The room empty and smelling like rubber and tiger balm, the way it always did when the students were gone. I saw his car in the lot Monday night, Knox said. He put both hands flat on the mat the way he did when he was processing something too heavy for words. He was watching through the glass door, the whole class. I thought he was being supportive. He paused. I don't think that anymore. Monday night. Day 2. The evening I taught 8 women how to break a wrist grip while my husband sat in his car cataloging every technique I demonstrated. He watched me teach the rotation, the finger lock, the exact counter I would use on him 24 hours later. And then he came home and attacked me anyway. What kind of man watches his wife teach self-defense on Monday and wraps his hand around her throat on Tuesday? The answer isn't rage. Rage is impulsive. Rage doesn't do reconnaissance. The answer is something colder, something that sits in a parked car for 75 minutes and takes notes and still decides that control is worth the risk. The nausea that hit me tasted like adrenaline returning, sharp and metallic at the back of my throat. I should have told you that night, Knox said. His calloused hand found my shoulder and stayed there. I told him it wouldn't have changed anything. We both knew that wasn't entirely true. But the guilt on his face was heavier than any correction I could offer, and I loved him too much to let him carry it alone. So I said it, and he nodded, and we stood on the mat in the empty dojo where he'd spent 20 years teaching me things I'd only just started to understand. That afternoon, the pattern added another thread. Imogen called and asked me to come to King Street. When I got there, she had her speakerphone on, and a man's voice was coming through, cautious and clipped, the voice of someone choosing each word like he was walking across ice. Barrett Sinclair was 34, a former sales coordinator who had worked 2 cubicles down from Corbin at the water treatment company. He'd heard about the arrest through mutual contacts and had called Imogen's office without being asked. That detail mattered. People who call without being asked are either brave or scared, and Barrett sounded like both. My father always said, liars don't get caught by someone smarter than them. They get by paperwork. Barrett had the paperwork. 3 years earlier, he'd filed an internal HR report about Corbin. He'd talked his way into covering the shared sales ops login while a coworker was out and never gave it back. A female colleague's expense approvals had been rerouted through Corbin's login. Her client contacts were being copied to his files. Her calendar was being accessed without her knowledge. Barrett had documented it, submitted it through the proper channel, and watched the company bury it under a label that read, Workflow Misunderstanding. They moved her to a different department, Barrett said through the speaker. Not him, her. And the report went into a drawer. Imogen wrote without looking up. I sat across from her desk, watching printouts and legal pad pages spread across the surface like a map of a place I was only beginning to see the shape of. Will you put this in a formal statement? Imogen asked. The line went quiet for 3 seconds. I need to think about it, Barrett said. I called because it's the right thing, but my name on a legal document against a former employer is a different conversation. Imogen held up one finger toward me, patience. He called, she said after hanging up. That's step 1. Step 2 is getting it on paper. He's not there yet. 3 data points. That's what she called them. A prior domestic complaint filed and withdrawn. A workplace control pattern documented and buried. A husband who'd conducted surveillance on his own wife's self-defense class before attacking her. 3 points make a line. But a line isn't evidence until someone is willing to say it out loud in a room that matters. The pattern wasn't forming. It was surfacing. It had been there all along, underneath the morning texts and the restaurant reservations and the vows he'd cried through. Every thread pointed in the same direction, a man who controlled, surveilled, and silenced, and every thread was one step short of being strong enough to hold up in front of a judge. Imogen looked at the notes spread across her desk. She took her glasses off and set them on top of the county record printout from 2 days ago. The one with the prior complaint, the filing date highlighted in yellow, the withdrawal stamped 6 weeks later. We have Barrett's information, but he's not ready to go on record. We have the surveillance, but it's Knox's word against Corbin's about a car in a parking lot. She tapped the highlighted date. We need the woman who withdrew. Without her, we have a pattern with no face. We need to know her name. Imogen found the name the next morning. It took her less than a day with the county database and a paralegal who knew how to cross-reference filing numbers with public records. Her name was Dagny Ellsworth. She was 29 years old, a veterinary technician living in Mount Pleasant, and until that moment, she had been nothing but a line item in a court filing that nobody was supposed to connect to my husband. Imogen read the details from the full record like a medical chart, clinical, careful, letting the facts land without pushing them. Dagny had been engaged to Corbin for 7 months. The complaint she filed described controlling behavior, restricted access to her own finances, and a physical altercation that escalated after she tried to end the engagement. The language was almost identical to mine. Escalation after being told no. The same trigger. The same pattern, the same man. She withdrew 5 weeks after filing. No explanation on record, just a signature on a withdrawal form and silence. If you contact her directly and his attorney finds out, they'll argue collusion, Imogen said. She set her glasses on the desk and looked at me. They'll say you coordinated your stories. It could compromise the entire filing. I want to be clear about what I was risking. If Corbin's lawyer could prove I'd reached out to Dagny before the hearing, every word she might say could be framed as rehearsed. The pattern evidence, the only thing strong enough to counter his narrative, could collapse. Imogen laid it out without telling me what to do. That was her way. She gave you the map and let you choose the road. That said, she added, I can't stop you from making a phone call. She let the sentence sit there between us on the desk, next to the printout with Dagny's name highlighted in yellow, and a phone number written in Imogen's handwriting in the margin. I took the printout home. I sat with it at the kitchen table that night, the same table where Corbin had laid out his color-coded schedule. and I turned it over in my hands until the paper was warm and soft at the edges. The rental house was quiet. The bleach smell had finally faded. The phone number stared up at me like a dare. Day 11. Morning. I called Knox first because I needed someone to talk me into it or out of it. He did neither. Knox never told me what to do. He just held the door open and let me see that I was already walking through it. "You already know what you're going to do, Belle," he said, which was his way of saying he trusted me to be right, even when being right was dangerous. I hung up. I poured coffee I wouldn't drink. I sat at the table and picked up the printout one more time and looked at Dagny Ellsworth's name and thought about a woman I'd never met who had walked into a courthouse and told the truth about the same man and then taken it back. I thought about what it must have felt like to file that complaint alone, without an Imogen, without a Knox, without anyone who said the words I was about to say. 4 rings. I almost hung up on the third, but I thought about Dagny walking that complaint back with no one standing beside her, and I decided that if nobody else was going to say it, I would. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice had the specific caution of someone who'd learned that phone calls from strangers weren't always safe. She said hello the way you open a door with the chain still on, just enough to see who's there. "My name is Bellamy. I'm married to Corbin Hewitt." I paused. "I was married to Corbin Hewitt. I found your filing in the county records." Silence. Not the confused kind. The kind that has weight. The kind where someone is deciding whether to stay on the line or disappear. "I didn't call to ask you for anything," I said. My hand was gripping the kitchen chair so hard, my knuckles were white. "I called to tell you I believe you. Whatever happened to you, I believe it. Because the same man just did it to me." The silence held for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then I heard her exhale. Not a sigh, not a cry. Just the sound of someone letting go of something they'd been holding for a very long time. The way you release a breath you didn't know you'd been keeping in your chest for months. "You're the one who broke his fingers," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. She'd already heard, and the fact that she'd been listening for news about Corbin tracking his name, following the story, waiting for the next version of herself to surface, told me everything I needed to know about how afraid she still was. She hadn't moved on. She'd just learned to be still, the way an animal learns to be still when the predator is close. And now, here was a stranger on the phone, telling her the predator had moved on to someone else, and the someone else had fought back. "Can we meet?" I asked. Another pause, shorter this time. "Yes," she said. "I think we need to." She'd been tracking his name since the arrest. Google alerts, court filings, local news. The woman who'd withdrawn her complaint hadn't stopped watching, she'd just stopped talking. Until now. Dagny Ellsworth was smaller than I'd imagined, and she chose the seat facing the door. I understood that instinct without either of us having to explain it. We sat in a cafe on King Street 2 days after the phone call, afternoon light coming through the window. The smell of fresh coffee and pastry between us, like a set piece for a conversation that belonged nowhere near a place this ordinary. She started where I would have started, the beginning. "He planned dates 3 weeks out," she said, and I set my coffee down because the sentence felt stolen from my own memory. He remembered her schedule after hearing it once. He texted every morning, not lazy, not generic, but specific. He asked about her day with the precision of someone filing a report. She used the word collected. He collected information about her shifts at the veterinary clinic, her friends' names, her passwords, not all at once, slowly, like someone filling out a form they'd filled out before. She used his exact words, not similar words, exact, as if he'd practiced the sentence enough times that it came out the same way with every woman, a script worn smooth by repetition. A system that ran the same way, regardless of who was sitting across the table. And when I told him I didn't want to cancel my Thursday night shifts at the clinic, he said. She paused. I finished it for her. "Don't turn this into a thing." Dagny stared at me. Her coffee cup stopped mid-rotation. How did you know that? Because he said it to me too. The night before, he put his hand on my throat. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The cafe hummed around us, espresso machines, quiet conversations, a world that had no idea what was being said at table 6. Dagny looked down at her hands and then back up, and her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. I filed the complaint 7 months into the engagement, she said. He shoved me into a wall after I told him I wanted to visit my sister in Greenville without him. The complaint described controlling behavior and a physical altercation. The officer who took it was polite and wrote everything down, and nothing happened for 3 weeks. I want you to understand something before you judge what she did next. She was 27. She was alone. She had no attorney, no father who'd spent 20 years teaching her how to stand, no Imogen reading arrest reports for patterns. She had a complaint on file that nobody followed up on, and a man whose parents were about to make her an offer. Lorraine called first, Dagny said. Her voice dropped the way voices drop when they reach the part of the story that still costs something to say. She didn't threaten me. That's the part people won't understand. She said, "We just want to help you move on," like it was generosity, like they were doing me a favor. 3 days after that call, $45,000 appeared in Dagny's bank account. The memo line read, "Transition support." There was no contract, no letter, no explicit condition, just a deposit and a phone call, and the unspoken understanding that the complaint would go away, because that's how people with money make problems disappear. They don't threaten, they help. They frame the silencing as care, and they wire the money before you've had time to think about what you're agreeing to. What do you call it when a family pays that kind of money to make a domestic violence complaint disappear and labels the wire transfer as support? You call it what it is. You call it a purchase. I was tired, Dagny said. Nobody believed me the first time I said it. And when someone finally acknowledged that something had happened, even if their version of acknowledging it was handing me a check to shut up, it was the closest thing to being heard that I'd gotten, so I took it. She turned her coffee cup in slow circles on the saucer. I've hated myself for it every day since. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She flinched and then didn't pull away. The cafe kept humming. The coffee went cold. Neither of us drank. They weren't protecting their son, Dagny said, looking at me with the steadiest eyes I'd seen since my father's. They were protecting their name, and they've been doing it long enough to know exactly what it costs. $45,000. That was the price the Hewitt family had put on one woman's silence wired clean, labeled soft, buried under a word that made it sound like kindness. And somewhere in a bank record that number was still sitting there, a receipt for a transaction that was never supposed to see daylight. Dagny had carried the weight of it for 16 months. She'd spent that time hating herself for taking money from people who should have been ashamed to offer it. And now she was sitting across from me in a cafe on King Street, telling me the truth she'd been paid to forget. And the only question left was whether someone with the right subpoena could find the wire transfer before the hearing. Imogen started working on the subpoena that afternoon. But before the bank records could surface, something else did something worse. Something that had been sitting in Corbin's work laptop the entire time. She called me on a Saturday morning, day 14, and said, "I need you to come to my office right now," in a voice I hadn't heard from her before. Not calm, not reassuring, just flat and urgent, the way someone talks when they've found something they can't unsee. I drove to King Street without eating breakfast. When I got there, Imogen had printouts desk, the way a detective lays out evidence on a board. She'd obtained records through the discovery process tied to the protective order proceedings files subpoenaed from Corbin's work laptop. Most of it was sales data, client lists, the ordinary guts of a regional sales territory. But buried in a subfolder labeled Personal, she'd found a spreadsheet. "Your schedule," she said, sliding the first page across the desk. "Your text contacts. Your father's dojo class times, updated weekly." She tapped the date on the first entry. He started this in March. 4 months. He'd been tracking my life for 4 months while texting me good morning and planning our wedding registry. The column headers were typed in a font I recognized from the printed schedule he'd laid on the kitchen table on day 1, the same neat formatting, the same organizational instinct. Schedule, contacts, frequency, response time. Like he was managing a sales territory, and I was the territory. I picked up the printout and read the columns. My Thursday grocery run, my Monday and Thursday dojo classes. The names of the 3 friends I texted most often, ranked by how quickly I responded to their messages. My father's phone number, highlighted in yellow with a note beside it that said, Primary Influence High. The March start date was circled in red 1 month after the family dinner, where Knox had told me to watch how Corbin handled the word no. 1 month after I'd dismissed the warning. He'd started cataloging my life the week after he met my father. The spreadsheet had column headers the way a farmer's ledger has column headers, inputs, outputs, yield. I was the crop. He was measuring whether I'd grow the way he planted me. I felt bile rise in my throat and swallowed it down and kept reading because stopping felt like letting him win something. This isn't temper, Imogen said quietly. This is infrastructure. She was right. The cohabitation rules on day 1, the joint calendar, the shared passwords, the single set of keys weren't a newlywed's enthusiasm. They were the visible edge of a system that had been running in the background for months. The day 2 dojo visit wasn't curiosity. It was a final data point, and day 3 wasn't a man losing his temper. It was a man losing his investment. I need you to understand that distinction. He didn't lose control in our kitchen. He lost compliance. I said no, and the spreadsheet, the 4-month plan, the surveillance, the infrastructure stopped producing the result it was designed to produce. What happened next wasn't rage. It was a system response. He didn't snap, Imogen said, leaning forward with her elbows on the desk. He executed. The rules on day 1 were a compliance test. The dojo visit was reconnaissance. When you said no on day 3, you weren't triggering a temper. You were failing an inspection. She let that word sit in the room. Inspection. It sounded clinical and cold and exactly right. This changes everything legally, she continued. This isn't a domestic dispute anymore. This is documented coercive control with a pre-existing surveillance pattern. The judge needs to see this. I sat in that chair and tried to reconcile 2 versions of the same man. The one who cried during his vows and held my face like I was something sacred, and the one who maintained a spreadsheet with my response times cataloged to the minute, my father labeled as a threat, and my dojo schedule highlighted because it represented the one part of my life he hadn't managed to absorb. I couldn't reconcile them. They were the same person. That was the whole point. The tears and the spreadsheet lived in the same man, and the tears were just another column in the system, filed under approach strategy. Imogen gathered the printouts into a folder and labeled it with a case number. She'd file it with the court before close of business. The preliminary hearing was tomorrow. For the first time since this started, I wasn't just trying to prove what happened in the kitchen. The kitchen was 3 days of a marriage. The spreadsheet was 4 months of a plan. The pattern was years of a man who did this before and would do it again if a courtroom didn't see what was sitting right there in labeled columns on a work laptop he'd forgotten to clean. Corbin Hewitt didn't lose control on day 3. He'd spent 4 months building a system designed to make sure he'd never have to. And when I broke the system by saying one word he hadn't accounted for, he did the only thing a man like that knows how to do when the spreadsheet stops working. He used his hands. Imogen filed the surveillance evidence with the court that evening. The next morning, I walked into a courtroom and faced the man whose system I'd broken, and he was wearing the tie I bought him, the navy one with the small silver pattern. I'd picked it out for his birthday in April, wrapped it in tissue paper, and watched him open it at a restaurant where he'd made the reservation 3 weeks in advance. Now he was sitting at the defense table with that tie knotted at his throat, and his two splinted fingers resting carefully on the wood, and I understood instantly that it was deliberate. Everything with Corbin was deliberate. The tie said, "I am still the man she loved." The splint said, "Look what she did to me." I was performing the wounded husband for a judge who hadn't decided yet, and the costume was made of my own generosity. I sat on the bench behind Imogen and pressed my palms flat against the wood and smelled his cologne from 12 feet away. The same cologne that used to mean safety and now meant something I'd spend years trying to unlearn. The bailiff called the room to order. The court reporter's keys began to click. "I want you to know what it's like to sit 12 feet from the man who choked you and watch him adjust his cuffs like he's at a business lunch. It's not fear. Not exactly. It's the feeling of being in a room where two realities exist at the same time, and a stranger in a robe gets to pick which one is real." Corbin's attorney went first. Roland Mercer, silver-haired, deliberate. The kind of lawyer who made sympathy feel like evidence. He called the incident a verbal disagreement that escalated. He used the word escalated 4 times. He never once used the word choked. He held up the medical report on the broken fingers and let the silence do the work. 2 broken fingers, inflicted by a woman with martial arts training, during what his client described as a conversation about household scheduling. He asked the court to consider who, in this room, bore the visible injury. Imogen stood, and I felt her hand squeeze my forearm once brief, firm, a signal that meant, watch. She laid out the arrest report. She presented the photographs of my throat, the bruises that had turned purple by the time the officer's camera caught them. She placed the surveillance spreadsheet in front of the judge and said, "Your Honor, this is not a domestic dispute. This is documented coercive control with a pre-existing surveillance pattern maintained for 4 months before the marriage." His attorney objected. The judge overruled. But she didn't decide. She read the spreadsheet for a long time, turning pages, her reading glasses catching the courtroom light. She looked at the photographs. She looked at the medical report. She looked at both of us, me on one side, Corbin on the other, and I watched her face and saw nothing. Not sympathy, not suspicion, just the careful blankness of a person whose job is to weigh 2 stories and not flinch. What do you do when fairness and justice aren't the same thing? When the system working exactly as designed still leaves you sitting on a wooden bench, wondering if the man who tracked your text response times is going to walk out of this room with a court order against you? "I've reviewed both petitions and the evidence submitted by both parties," the judge said. She spoke the way judges speak, measured, colorless, as if emotion were a conflict of interest. "The court finds that the evidence presented today is substantial but incomplete. I'm granting both parties 10 additional days to submit supplemental evidence before I issue a ruling on either petition. 10 more days, not a win, not a loss. A continuance, the legal equivalent of come back with more." Imogen nodded like she'd expected it. Corbin's attorney closed his folder with a satisfied click, as if delay were a strategy he'd ordered off a menu. I walked out of the courtroom, and the cold metal of the door handle bit into my palm, and the hallway smelled like floor wax. And I drank water from a paper cup that tasted like nothing. Imogen walked beside me without speaking until we reached the lobby. "The spreadsheet rattled her," Imogen said. "She didn't dismiss it. She asked for more time because she's taking it seriously, but she needs corroboration. The spreadsheet alone is data. We need the voices to go with it." The voices. Barrett, who'd called but wouldn't sign. Dagny, who'd met me at a cafe but hadn't said she'd take the stand. The bank transfer that proved the Hewitts had purchased silence, still sitting in a record somewhere waiting for a subpoena that hadn't been filed. 10 days. The judge gave us 10 days to prove that what happened in my kitchen wasn't a moment, but a pattern. That the man in the navy tie had done this before, documented it before, and would do it again if a courtroom didn't connect the threads. I had a witness who wouldn't go on record, a woman who hadn't agreed to testify, and a financial trail nobody had pulled yet. 10 days to turn threads into a rope strong enough to hold. The first thread held. On day 16, Barrett Sinclair walked into Imogen's office carrying a manila folder he'd kept in his apartment closet for 3 years, the edges worn soft from waiting. He sat in the same chair I'd sat in 12 days earlier and signed his name at the bottom of a formal statement. When I asked him why now, he set his pen down and looked at me with the tired honesty of a man who'd been carrying something too long. "Because the company told me it was a misunderstanding," he said, "and I spent 3 years knowing it wasn't." The folder held the original HR report, 2 pages, single-spaced, dated 3 years back. It documented Corbin accessing a female colleague's client files without authorization, rerouting her expense approvals through his own account, flagging her calendar entries for review. Barrett had submitted it through the proper channel. The company's response was 1 sentence at the bottom of the 2nd page. Resolved internally, no further action required. They moved the woman to a different department. Not Corbin, her. Imogen read it twice. Then she laid it on the desk beside the surveillance spreadsheet and the county complaint from Dagny's filing. 3 documents, 3 sources, 3 different years, all describing the same architecture: a man who controlled access, monitored behavior, and punished non-compliance. The same system, running the same way, regardless of whether the target was a colleague, a fiancé, or a wife. "This is a case now," Imogen said, "not just a story. 3 lives reduced to evidence on a desk. 3 women who'd walked into the same pattern at different doors. And 1 company that decided resolved internally was the same thing as resolved." Before I tell you what happened next, before I explain how close the whole thing came to falling apart, I need to ask, do you think Dagny should testify? Or was she right to protect herself? Comment your answer and tell me why, because this next part is where everything turns. A quick note, what follows contains some recreated details for narrative impact. The message behind it is what I hope stays with you. Dagny called on day 18. I knew something was wrong before she finished saying my name. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone holding themselves together by refusing to feel anything at all. "They know," she said. "Someone told them I talked to you. I don't know who, but Lorraine left me a voicemail and I can't bring myself to listen to it." Before I tell you what she said next, I need you to understand something. Fear isn't weakness. Fear is what happens when you've already been through it once and your body remembers what your mind is trying to forget. Dagny had filed a complaint and watched it dissolve. She'd taken money she didn't want from people who framed silence as a favor. She'd spent 16 months rebuilding a life around the hole that left, and now someone was asking her to walk back into the room where all of it happened and say it again, out loud, in front of the man she'd been paid to stop talking about. "If I speak and they win again, I don't know what I have left," she said. Her voice cracked on the word left, and I heard her swallow hard. "Last time, I lost everything. My apartment, my confidence, my belief that anyone would take my side. I can't lose those things twice." I held the phone and listened to her breathing go uneven and thought about what the Hewitts' money had really purchased. Not silence. Something worse, the kind of fear that outlasts the payment by years, that lives in your chest like a second heartbeat, that activates the moment a Somerville area code appears on your phone. I didn't argue with her. I didn't try to convince her. I said, "I understand." Because I did. The worst thing I could do to someone who'd already been silenced once was make her feel like her fear didn't count. She said she needed time. I said she had it. We hung up. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and my phone in my lap and counted what remained. 7 days until the deadline. Barrett's statement was signed and filed. The surveillance spreadsheet was in evidence. Imogen had subpoenaed the bank records and was waiting on the response. The bones of the case were solid. But bones aren't enough. A judge can read documents and see data points. What a judge can't get from paper is the sound of a woman's voice describing what it felt like to hear the same words from the same man, the same charm, the same control, the same flat sentence designed to end every conversation before it became accountability. Barrett's report proved the pattern existed in a workplace. The spreadsheet proved it existed in a marriage. But without Dagny, the pattern had no face, no voice, no story the court could hear from someone who'd lived inside it and survived. And I couldn't make her do it. I wouldn't, because the moment I pressured Dagny Ellsworth into speaking was the moment I became another person, telling her what to do with her own story. And I'd had enough of people doing that to last me the rest of my life. So I did the only thing I could think of. I drove to the one place where I'd always gone when I didn't know what came next. I pulled into the gravel lot of my father's dojo at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night. The building was dark except for a single overhead light in the main room. Knox was sitting cross-legged on the mat like he'd been waiting, though I hadn't called ahead. That was my father. He didn't need a warning to know when his daughter was coming apart. I sat across from him on the blue mat and told him everything. Dagny's call, the fear in her voice, the Hewitts reaching out again. How I'd hung up without arguing because I couldn't be another person telling her what to do with her own pain. Knox listened the way he always listened, completely still, reading the space between my words, his aftershave mixing with the rubber mat smell of a room that had held every version of me since I was 8. I can't ask her, I said. If I push and she breaks, that's on me. Knox was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I didn't expect. I taught you just in case, he said. Not so you'd carry everything by yourself. You need someone standing beside you, Belle. And maybe she does too. Maybe that's what you call her to say. My father had spent 20 years teaching me how to protect myself. It took him one sentence to teach me something harder, how to let someone else stand next to me while I did it. He wasn't telling me to convince Dagny. He was telling me to show up for her. There's a difference. And Knox was the kind of man who understood it without having to explain it twice. He put his hand on my shoulder in the dojo doorway when I left. Didn't say anything else. The gravel crunched under my shoes, and the Charleston night air tasted like salt. And I sat in my car in the parking lot and dialed Dagny's number. She answered on the second ring. She'd been awake. I could hear it in her voice, the ragged edge of someone who hadn't slept and wasn't going to. I didn't convince Dagny to testify. I want to be clear about that. I offered to be present. She made the choice herself. Nobody gets to take that from her. What I said was this. You don't have to do this alone either. If you walk into that room, I'll be sitting right there. She was quiet so long, I heard a dog bark somewhere in her neighborhood. The silence stretched past the point where most people would fill it with something, a reason, a plea, a persuasion dressed as encouragement. I let it sit. My father had just taught me the value of not pushing, and I wasn't going to waste the lesson before the night was over. What time? Dagny said. 2 words. That was all. No speech about courage. No dramatic declaration. Just a woman deciding, in her own time, on her own terms, that being afraid wasn't the same as being finished. Day 25. Deadline day. Dagny walked into Imogen's office at 10 in the morning, carrying a shoebox. Not a briefcase, not a folder, a shoebox. The kind you keep under your bed when you don't want to look at what's inside, but can't bring yourself to throw it away. The cardboard was rough under her fingers, and the lid was held on with a rubber band. Inside, her original complaint, printouts of Lorraine's emails from 16 months ago, the sympathetic language of a woman helping you move on by making sure you never spoke again. And a bank statement with a highlighted line item, a deposit the Hewitts had labeled with 2 words that sounded like generosity and meant something else entirely. Imogen held the bank statement up to the light like it was made of glass. She set it beside Barrett's HR report and the surveillance spreadsheet and the arrest photographs. And she looked at the desk the way an architect looks at a finished blueprint, not with triumph, but with the quiet certainty that every beam was where it needed to be. "This is ready," she said. 13 minutes. We filed the full case with 13 minutes before the courthouse closed on the last day. The judge would accept supplemental evidence. Imogen didn't rush. She never rushed. She checked every page, every exhibit number, every signature line. She handed the package to the clerk at 4:47 p.m., and the stamp came down on the final page with a sound that echoed off the marble lobby floor. The clerk slid the receipt across the counter, and I stood in the courthouse lobby with Imogen on one side and Dagny on the other. 22 days. That's how long it had taken to build a file from an arrest report and a bruised throat into something that filled a clerk's folder, a surveillance spreadsheet, a buried HR report, a prior complaint, a bank statement with a number the Hewitts never expected to see daylight, and 2 women's stories that matched in every detail that mattered. The file was complete. Now we waited for the room where it would either save us or not. 5 days passed like a held breath. Then the room came. Courtroom 4B smelled like old wood and floor wax, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I pressed them flat against my thighs under the table and willed them still, and they refused, trembling with the particular frequency of a body that knows something is about to happen and can't decide whether it's ready. Corbin was already seated at the opposite table when I walked in. He'd cut his hair. He wore a light blue shirt and a soft gray tie, not the navy one this time. Something gentler, something chosen by someone who understood optics. His splinted fingers were gone, replaced by 2 fingers taped neatly together with flesh-colored athletic wrap that blended into his hand unless you knew to look. He sat with his shoulders slightly rounded, his posture a studied version of humility. The man who'd tracked my text response times in a spreadsheet had been coached to look like someone whose wife had hurt him for no reason. Beside him sat Roland Mercer, his defense attorney, silver-haired, 60-something, the kind of lawyer who wore his authority like a well-fitted suit and made sympathy feel like evidence. Mercer had the calm of a man who'd done this hundreds of times and believed winning was a matter of cadence. Imogen squeezed my forearm under the table. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Caldwell, the same judge from the preliminary hearing, measured and unhurried, took the bench and opened the file. You want to believe a courtroom is where truth wins. It's not. It's where preparation wins. Truth is a passenger. Preparation is the driver. And both sides had spent the last 10 days preparing versions of the same story that couldn't both be real. Mercer went first. He stood without notes and spoke the way a surgeon operates, precise, unhurried. Every word placed with the confidence of a man who'd rehearsed until the rehearsal disappeared. He called the incident a marital disagreement that escalated into violence. His client's fingers broken by a woman with decades of martial arts training. He said the word training 3 times, each time letting it hang like an accusation. He held up the medical photographs of Corbin's hand and let the courtroom look. My client has no prior convictions, Mercer said. No criminal record, no history of violence. What he has is a 72-hour marriage and 2 broken fingers. I didn't mention the bruises on my throat. He didn't mention the arrest. He didn't mention the word Corbin had said before his hand closed the one about belonging. He edited the story the way you'd edit a sales report, removing the numbers that didn't support the conclusion. I didn't look at me once. Not once. He looked at the judge, at his notes, at the gallery. Never at me. That was deliberate, too. Looking at me would have acknowledged me as a person. Not looking made me a subject, something to be discussed, not someone to be addressed. Imogen stood when it was her turn. She didn't use the slow burn approach Mercer favored. She laid documents on the podium the way a builder lays bricks one at a time, each one load-bearing. The arrest report. The photographs of my throat, purple and documented by a responding officer within the hour. The surveillance spreadsheet from Corbin's work laptop, 4 months of my schedule, my contacts, my response times tracked in columns. Barrett Sinclair's signed statement describing the buried HR report. The prior complaint filed by another woman and withdrawn 6 weeks later. Your Honor, Imogen said, what the respondent calls an isolated incident has a paper trail that stretches back 3 years. This is not a man who lost his temper during a scheduling disagreement. This is a man who maintained surveillance infrastructure on his wife for 4 months before the marriage, who was the subject of a prior domestic complaint by a former partner, and whose workplace behavior was documented by a colleague and buried by his employer. Mercer objected. Your Honor, prior complaints that were voluntarily withdrawn have no evidentiary weight. My client was never charged, never convicted, and the complainant herself chose not to pursue. The complainant, Imogen said, is here today, and she can speak to why she withdrew. The courtroom shifted. I felt it, not a sound, exactly, but a change in pressure, the way a room tightens when something unexpected enters the space. Mercer's pen stopped moving. Corbin's jaw tightened by a fraction, the first crack in the performance, so small that only someone who'd spent 8 months studying his face would have caught it. I caught it. How do you prove a pattern to someone who's only willing to see a single dot? You don't argue about the dot. You show them the line. Imogen paused. She let the silence hold for 3 full seconds, long enough for the court reporter's keys to stop, long enough for Mercer to realize he didn't have a prepared response, long enough for the judge to look up from her file. Your Honor, this is not an isolated incident. Imogen's voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of that wood-paneled room. And with the court's permission, I'd like to call the woman who can prove it. The judge granted permission. The gallery door opened, and Dagny walked in. She stood up slowly from the back row, like someone who'd rehearsed the motion 100 times but still wasn't sure her legs would hold. She was wearing a dark blouse, and her hair was pulled back, and her hands were clasped in front of her, the way people hold themselves when they're trying to keep something inside from shaking loose. She walked past me without looking over, not out of coldness, but out of focus. If she looked at me, she might lose what she'd built in herself to get here. I understood that. I'd done the same thing walking in. She took the stand and stated her name, and Imogen began. The story came out the way truth does when it's been held too long in pieces at first, then in a current. Dagny described meeting Corbin, the charm, the planning, the morning texts that arrived with surgical precision. She said he told her she was the only person who really understood him on their 3rd date, and I felt the air leave my lungs because I'd heard that sentence in my own kitchen, in his voice, with the same cadence. When I tried to leave the first time, Dagny said, her voice shaking but not stopping, he told me no one would believe me because I had nothing without him. I wanted to reach across the courtroom and hold her hand. I couldn't, so I held still and let her words do what mine hadn't yet prove, that the man sitting 12 feet away didn't lose control. He ran a program, and Dagny and I were 2 iterations of the same script, separated by 16 months and connected by every phrase he'd ever worn smooth through repetition. She described the escalation. The shove into a wall after she told him she wanted to visit her sister alone. The complaint she filed, the weeks of silence from the system. And then the call, Lorraine's voice, sympathetic and careful, offering help. Mercer stood for cross-examination. He buttoned his jacket and approached the stand with the measured pace of a man who believed he had one question that would end this. Ms. Ellsworth, isn't it true that you accepted a financial settlement and voluntarily withdrew your complaint? Yes, Dagny said, and nobody forced you to withdraw. You made that choice freely. Dagny looked at him. Then she looked past him, at me, for the first time since she'd entered the room. The look lasted less than a second, but it carried the weight of every conversation we'd had at that cafe table, every phone call at midnight, every moment she'd spent deciding whether this was worth the risk. "I was 27, she said. "I was alone. Nobody believed me the first time I said it. And when someone offered me money to stop saying it, it was the closest thing to being heard I'd gotten." She paused. "I made a choice, but free isn't the word I'd use." Mercer opened his mouth and closed it. He returned to his seat. Imogen stood again. She picked up a single sheet of paper from the podium, the certified bank record she'd subpoenaed 2 weeks earlier, and held it so the judge could see. "Your Honor, Exhibit 14, a wire transfer from the joint account of Vaughn and Lorraine Hewitt to Dagny Ellsworth, $45,000, dated March 12, 2021. She set a second document beside it. "And this is the withdrawal form Ms. Ellsworth signed to drop her complaint, also dated March 12, 2021. $45,000. That's what silencing a woman cost the Hewitt family." A rough number, not an estimate. A line item on a bank statement with a memo that read, "Transition support," as if helping someone transition out of the truth was a charitable act. I looked at the gallery. Vaughn Hewitt shifted in his seat, his hand moving to his tie the way a man's hand moves when his collar suddenly feels too tight. Lorraine sat perfectly still, her face drained of color, staring at a fixed point on the wall behind the judge's head. They hadn't expected this. They'd wired that money believing it would stay buried under a polite label, and now it was sitting on a courtroom podium with 2 dates highlighted in yellow. Imogen let the silence do the work. She didn't editorialize. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "The memo line reads, 'Transition support.' I'd asked the court to consider what transition was being supported." The number hung in this courtroom air, like something detonated that hadn't finished falling. Mercer didn't object. There was nothing to object to. The bank record was certified, the dates were facts, and facts don't need rhetoric when they're this clean. Judge Caldwell looked at the bank record, then at the withdrawal form, then back at the bank record. She adjusted her glasses and read the dates one more time, and I watched her expression shift, not dramatically, not with outrage, but with the quiet recalibration of a person who has just realized the story she was weighing is larger than the room she's sitting in. The dates weren't close. They weren't similar. They were identical. March 12th, 2021. The same day, the same transaction, the same silence purchased and delivered before the ink was dry. The judge set the bank record down and called a 15-minute recess. She hadn't ruled yet, but the way she placed those 2 pages side by side before leaving the bench told everyone in the room what she'd seen. Lorraine Hewitt's attorney crossed the aisle before the judge's door had fully closed. He was a compact man in a charcoal suit. I hadn't noticed until that moment he'd been sitting behind the Hewitts in the gallery the entire hearing, quiet as furniture. And now he was moving toward Imogen with the purposeful stride of someone executing a contingency plan. He introduced himself as the Hewitts' personal counsel, separate from Mercer, and asked if they could speak in the hallway. Imogen looked at me. I nodded. The hallway outside courtroom 4B smelled like floor polish and old radiator heat. The Hewitts stood against the wall. Vaughn with his hands in his pockets, Lorraine with her arms crossed, and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past my left shoulder. She wouldn't look at me, not out of shame, out of calculation. She was assessing the damage and deciding which pieces of her life could be salvaged if she moved fast enough. "My clients are prepared to cooperate fully," their attorney said, in exchange for the court's consideration regarding their involvement in the withdrawal of Ms. Ellsworth's complaint. Parents are supposed to protect their children. But when the child is the danger, some parents just protect themselves. That's what I was watching, not a moral reckoning, not a family torn apart by conscience, but a liability assessment performed in real time by 2 people who'd spent their lives managing risk. Vaughn had been an insurance underwriter. Lorraine had administered a church office. They knew how institutions protected themselves, and they were doing it now, with their son's future as the cost of the premium. They handed over text messages, printouts from Lorraine's phone showing conversations with Corbin from before the payment, to Dagny messages that proved they knew about the prior complaint before they wired the money, that they'd discussed strategy, that the word transition had been Lorraine's suggestion. Not Vaughn's, Lorraine's. The church administrator had chosen the euphemism that dressed up silencing as support. Imogen took the documents without making promises. "We'll present these to the court," she said. "What the judge does with them is her decision." We walked back into the courtroom. The recess ended. Judge Caldwell returned to the bench and opened the file, and the room went still with the particular silence of people waiting to hear something that will change the shape of their lives. Corbin sat at the defense table with Mercer beside him. His coached composure was thinner now. I could see it in the way his good hand gripped the edge of the table, the knuckles white, the performance of calm costing him more with every minute. Mercer leaned over and whispered something. Corbin didn't respond. He stared straight ahead at a point on the wall the way his mother had stared in the hallway, and I realized they'd taught him that how to look at nothing when everything was falling apart. Judge Caldwell spoke. She was the kind of judge who read every page before opening her mouth, measured, unhurried, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that the words she was about to say would follow everyone in this room for the rest of their lives. "The court finds sufficient evidence of a sustained pattern of coercive control and domestic violence," she said. "The respondent's petition for a protective order against the petitioner is denied. The petitioner's request for a long-term protective order is granted, effective immediately." Corbin's jaw moved, but no sound came out. His hand tightened on the table edge. Mercer placed a palm on his forearm, steadying, restraining, the gesture of a lawyer who knew what a client's outburst could cost at this stage. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore, the court is referring this matter, including all exhibits entered today, to the Charleston County District Attorney's Office for prosecutorial review. The evidence presented suggests a pattern of conduct that extends beyond the scope of this proceeding." Do you know what it sounds like when a courtroom believes you? It sounds like nothing. Just the scratch of a pen on an order and the quiet click of a court reporter's keys recording the words that will become the official record. No applause, no dramatic moment, just a woman in a robe saying what the evidence required her to say, and a room full of people absorbing it in silence. Imogen's hand found my forearm under the table and squeezed once. I didn't move. I sat perfectly still, because I was afraid that if I moved, even slightly, the feeling inside me would come apart. The relief and the anger and the vindication and the grief, all tangled together into something I didn't have a name for and wasn't sure I wanted to untangle yet. The court adjourned. I walked into the hallway holding a signed protective order, the paper warm in my hands, the ink still fresh, and listened to Imogen explain that the DA's office would contact us within 2 weeks. The court had taken the evidence we'd built in 27 days and decided it was enough not just to protect me, but to investigate him. I didn't need to file anything more. The court did it for me. The protective order was signed, the referral was filed, and now there was one last thing to watch the man who'd built a system around my life walking out of the building where that system had been dismantled. Corbin stopped at the courtroom door and turned his head like he had one more thing to say. Courthouse security flanked him, one on each side, hands not touching him, but close enough to steer. His taped fingers hung at his side. His coached composure was gone now, replaced by something rawer, something I recognized from the kitchen on day 3, the expression of a man who'd lost control of a situation he believed he'd engineered to win. He looked toward me. Not at me, toward me. The way you look at a door you're about to lose access to. His mouth opened. I saw the breath gather. I saw the word forming. I didn't turn around. That was always the last move in his playbook. Make me watch him leave, so I'd feel the absence, so I'd carry the image of his departure like a weight I'd have to set down later. He'd done it at the preliminary hearing, walking out with his splinted hand displayed. He'd done it the night of the arrest, looking at his broken fingers instead of at me. Every exit was a performance designed to make the person left behind feel responsible for the empty room. I kept my eyes on the wall. I heard his footsteps on the linoleum, measured at first, then faster, then gone. The courtroom door closed with a soft mechanical click, and the hallway got quieter. And that was all it was. A man walking away from what he'd built. Not dramatically, not memorably, just footsteps fading until they became part of the building's ambient silence. Some endings don't slam. They click shut like a lock you didn't know you'd been holding open. And the relief isn't a rush. It's the sudden awareness that a pressure you'd been living under so long you'd stopped noticing it has finally, quietly, lifted. Imogen touched my shoulder. "We're done here," she said. 2 words that meant more than the ruling, more than the referral, more than any document stamped in any courthouse. We were done. I was done. The thing I'd been building for 27 days, from a blood-stained kitchen tile to a courtroom where a judge believed me, was finished. Not perfectly, not with a bow on top, but finished. I walked out of the courthouse into the late July sun. The parking lot, asphalt, shimmered with heat, and the air smelled like warm concrete and magnolia from the trees along the courthouse lawn. Dagny was already outside. She was sitting on the low wall by the parking lot entrance, her dark blouse untucked, her shoes off, her feet on the warm stone. She looked up when I came through the door, and she didn't say anything. She just moved over to make room. I sat beside her. 2 women on a courthouse wall in the South Carolina heat, not talking, not needing to. She'd walked into that courtroom and said the hardest thing she'd ever had to say a second time, in front of the man she'd been paid to forget. She'd done it not because I'd asked, I hadn't, but because she'd decided on her own that being afraid wasn't the same as being finished. Dagny didn't say anything. She just sat beside me, and that was enough. 2 women who'd survived the same man, standing in the same sun, with nothing left to prove to anyone. I took out my phone. The screen was cracked, the same crack from day 3, the one I'd never gotten fixed because replacing it felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. I dialed my father's number. He answered before the second ring finished, the way he always did when he knew it mattered. "Are you okay?" Knox asked. The same question. The exact same words he'd said the night I called him from the kitchen floor with bleach on my hands and blood in the grout. The same steady voice. The same single question with no follow-up, no elaboration, just the trust that I'd answer honestly because he'd raised me to. But this time was different. The night of the arrest, I'd opened my mouth to say yes, and nothing came out. I hadn't known what I was. I'd been vibrating with adrenaline and flatness, and the particular confusion of a woman whose marriage had lasted 3 days and ended with a 911 call. You spend months fighting to be believed. You build a case and find witnesses and sit in courtrooms and watch lawyers argue about whether your throat being choked counts as an isolated incident. And then someone who loves you asks if you're okay, and you realize the fight was never about them believing you. It was about you believing yourself. "Yeah, Dad," I said. "I am." It was the first time in months I'd said it and meant every word. Not performing, not surviving, not saying what someone needed to hear so they'd stop worrying. Just the truth, delivered to the one person who'd spent 20 years making sure I'd be able to say it. I hung up and looked at Dagny. She was smiling, not the kind that means happy, but the kind that means free. I had a protective order and a pending criminal referral, and a woman beside me who understood everything. What I didn't have yet was a place to live that felt like mine. The place that felt like mine would come later. First came the paperwork that made the old place officially not mine anymore. The pen was heavier than I expected for something that was supposed to set me free. Imogen's office in October looked the same as it had in July. Leather chairs, legal pads, cold coffee on the desk, but I was different sitting in it. The woman who'd walked in 3 months ago with bruises on her throat and a cracked phone screen was not the woman signing her name on the final page of an annulment she hadn't asked for, but absolutely needed. Months had compressed. August through October folded into each other like chapters in a book you read too fast. Each one important, none of them dramatic, all of them necessary. The DA's office had taken the evidence package from the hearing and done what the court asked them to do. They upgraded the charges against Corbin felony domestic violence with a pattern enhancement based on the full record the judge had referred. That was the state's fight now, not mine. Imogen explained it simply. The criminal case would proceed regardless of what I did or didn't do. The system had enough. The annulment went through uncontested. Corbin's attorney Mercer had advised him not to challenge it. Reopening the record meant re-exposing the surveillance file, the bank transfer, Dagny's testimony, all of it. Fighting the annulment meant putting every exhibit back on a courtroom table, and nobody on his side wanted that. His attorney filed no objection, Imogen said, setting the final document in front of me. The annulment is effective as of today. People ask if annulment feels different from divorce. It does. Divorce says it's over. Annulments, it never should have started. It's a legal acknowledgement that the thing you built your hope around was flawed from its foundation. Not just broken, but void. As if the ceremony and the vows and the string lights between the live oaks were a draft that never should have been submitted. I signed my name. I set the pen down. I thought I'd feel something loss, maybe, or relief, or the particular ache of closing a door you once walked through, believing it led somewhere worth going. What I felt was my hand moving across paper. And then it was done. Imogen collected the pages and squared them into a folder. One more thing, she said. The DA's office has formally upgraded to felony domestic violence with a pattern enhancement. That's not us anymore. That's the state. And Vaughn and Lorraine? I asked. The DA's office declined to pursue charges against them directly, Imogen said. Insufficient evidence of criminal intent. Their cooperation bought them exactly what their attorney promised: consideration, not immunity. It just meant the state didn't come after them too. It didn't mean they walked away clean. I nodded. The state. The machinery of justice doing what it does when enough documents line up in the right order. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindication. I felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who'd spent 3 months feeding a system and was now watching it digest without her. I drove back to the rental house and sat in the kitchen and drank coffee that tasted like nothing and stared at the counter where a printed schedule had started all of this. The house was quiet. It had been quiet for months, the useful kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't press against you, but it still wasn't mine. It was a place I lived because I'd had to leave somewhere else. There's a difference between shelter and home, and I was ready for the second one. The letter arrived in late November. A thick envelope, hand-addressed, Somerville return address. I knew who it was from before I opened it. Vaughn and Lorraine's handwriting, his on the envelope. Hers inside. 2 pages, front and back. Written in the careful cursive of people who'd drafted it more than once. They acknowledged what they'd done. They used Dagny's name. They said they should have listened. They said they should not have asked her to stay quiet. They said they were sorry for the part they played. How do you accept an apology that's only brave enough to admit half of what happened? They were sorry for the part they played. Not all of it the part. As if involvement came in fractions and they'd only owned a sliver. As if wiring money to silence a woman and then calling me 6 days after my husband choked me to explain that every marriage has a rough patch were 2 unrelated incidents committed by 2 different versions of themselves. The letter didn't mention the phone call to me. It didn't mention the voicemail to Dagny. It didn't mention the charcoal-suited attorney who'd crossed the courtroom aisle to cut a deal while their son sat at the defense table watching his parents save themselves. It mentioned the things that were already public record and nothing that wasn't. I read it twice. I folded it along the original creases and put it in the kitchen drawer next to take-out menus and a spare key. I didn't throw it away. I didn't answer it. I didn't show it to Knox or Dagny or Imogen. I just let it sit there, the way some truths have to sit until you're ready to decide what they're worth. Forgiveness isn't a door you open all at once. It's a drawer you check every few months to see if something inside has changed. I wasn't ready to open that drawer again yet, but I hadn't locked it either. I left the letter in the drawer when I moved. I didn't bring the drawer, just the letter, tucked into a shoebox with the annulment papers and one photograph I wasn't ready to throw away. Everything else stayed behind in the rental. I wanted nothing from that kitchen. The first box I carried into the West Ashley apartment was the lightest one: books, a mug, a framed photo of Knox at the dojo from 10 years ago, and it was still the heaviest thing I'd moved in months. Not because of the weight, because of what it meant. Every object I placed on a shelf in this apartment was a choice I was making alone, for myself, without consulting a schedule or a spreadsheet, or a man who kept inventory of my life. Knox had offered to help. Dagny had offered. 2 colleagues from school had offered. I said no to all of them, not because I didn't want them there, but because I needed to carry the boxes myself. I needed my hands on every object that entered these rooms. I needed to be the one who decided which cabinet held the glasses and which drawer got the silverware. After a year of having my choices cataloged, rerouted, and overridden, the act of deciding where a coffee mug lived felt like reclaiming territory. The apartment was small. 1 bedroom, a bathroom with a window that stuck, a kitchen with a gas stove, and a counter just big enough for a cutting board. The living room faced east, and in the morning, the light came through the blinds in long gold bars that stretched across the hardwood floor. It smelled like fresh paint and the faintly chemical scent of new carpet in the bedroom. Nothing bad had happened in these rooms. No one had been hurt here. No schedule had been printed in this kitchen. That was enough. People tell you starting over is brave. They don't tell you what it looks like. It looks like standing in an empty kitchen at 2 in the afternoon, wondering which cabinet should hold the glasses. It looks like sitting on the floor eating takeout because the table hasn't been delivered yet. It looks like testing every light switch in every room just to prove to yourself that they all work, and you're the one who gets to turn them on. I unpacked slowly, not because I was savoring it, though I was, but because rushing felt like someone else's habit. Corbin rushed. Corbin had systems and timelines and color-coded plans for every room. I was done living on someone else's schedule. If I wanted to spend an entire Saturday afternoon deciding where to hang a single towel rack, I could. If I wanted to leave the walls blank for a week, I could do that too. I left them blank. Not out of sadness, because I liked the blankness. A wall with nothing on it is a wall that's waiting for you to choose. And I'd spent the last year in rooms where someone else had already decided what every surface was for. The emptiness wasn't absence, it was room. By late afternoon, the boxes were empty and broken down and stacked by the front door for recycling. The furniture was coming tomorrow: a bed frame from a consignment shop, a kitchen table I'd found online, a couch that was too big for the living room but exactly what I wanted. For now, the apartment was just walls and floors and light, and I stood in the center of the living room and waited for the panic. It didn't come. I'd been bracing for it since July, the moment when the silence would stop feeling like safety and start feeling like loneliness. The moment when being alone would collapse into being abandoned, and all the strength I'd built would dissolve into the quiet of an empty room at dusk. I'd been afraid of this silence for months. I'd imagined it would sound like the kitchen after the patrol car pulled away, heavy and permanent and full of things that couldn't be undone. But this silence was different. This was the kind you choose, the kind that exists because no one is going to walk through that door unless you want them to. No footsteps in the hallway that make your shoulders tighten. No key in the lock that you didn't expect. No voice from the other room asking where you've been, who you've talked to, why you're home 4 minutes later than the schedule says. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and cried. Not the broken kind, the clean kind, the kind that washes instead of drowns. I cried because I'd just turned 29 a few weeks earlier and was sitting in an apartment I'd chosen for myself, in a neighborhood where nobody knew my name, and the sun was going down through a window that faced east, and the last light was moving across the floor like a hand saying goodbye to the day. I cried because it was over, because I'd survived it, because somewhere across town a man was facing felony charges and his parents' letter was sitting in a shoebox I'd packed without deciding what to do with it, and none of that was my problem to solve tonight. The sun moved across the empty floor, and I stood still long enough to hear myself think. Not what he thought, not what his parents thought, not what a judge decided. Just me, in a room with no history, listening to the first silence that belonged to no one but me. Silence became something I wore into January and then February, not like armor, but like a coat that finally fit. The apartment filled slowly, a second-hand bookshelf, a jade plant from the hardware store on King Street, a set of mismatched mugs I chose because nobody else had to approve them. And somewhere in the middle of all that quiet, Dagny started texting me about things that had nothing to do with courtrooms. She was already laughing when I walked into the cafe on Upper King that Saturday morning. Not at anything specific, just at her phone. At some video of a dog failing to catch a treat in midair. She turned it toward me before I even sat down, and I laughed too. And neither of us mentioned that 6 months ago the only reason we knew each other's names was because the same man had hurt us both. That was the twist I hadn't expected. Not the hearing, not the ruling, not even the annulment paperwork that had arrived the week before, with a finality that felt more like exhaling than winning. The twist was this. Dagny and I talked about groceries now, about a documentary on deep-sea creatures she'd watched twice because the narrator's voice put her to sleep in a good way, about whether oat milk was actually better or just more expensive. The ordinary moments were the victory, and I hadn't seen that coming. She ordered a cortado, and I ordered black coffee, because I'd never stopped being my father's daughter in that one specific way. The barista called my name, and I walked to the counter, and the ceramic was warm against my palms when I carried it back. The cafe smelled like roasted beans and sourdough bread, and through the window I could see a couple walking a greyhound past the fountain on the corner, and none of it was remarkable, and all of it was mine. You don't pick your friends when you're drowning. You just grab whoever reaches back. But sometimes, the person who reaches back turns out to be exactly who you needed all along, not because they saved you, but because they understood what the water felt like. Dagny told me about a date she'd gone on the previous weekend. A guy from her gym who spent 45 minutes talking about his meal prep schedule and then asked if she wanted to come back to his place to see his spice rack. She delivered the punchline with a straight face, and I nearly choked on my coffee. He said it like it was romantic, she said, shaking her head, like cumin was going to seal the deal. I wiped my mouth with a napkin. Did you at least see the spice rack? I did not, she said. I told him I had an early shift. We both knew that was a lie. Dagny worked Tuesdays and Thursdays at the veterinary clinic on Folly Road. Saturday shifts hadn't been a thing since she'd rearranged her schedule the previous fall. But the lie was gentle, and it belonged to her, and she didn't owe anyone an explanation for leaving a date that wasn't working. I thought about how different that was from the years I'd spent constructing reasons to stay. When does a person you survived with become a person you actually live alongside, not under the same roof, but in the same ordinary world? I think it happens the moment you stop referencing the crisis. The moment the shared language shifts from evidence and timelines to bad dates and overpriced milk. She asked about my dad. I told her Knox had started offering a Saturday afternoon class for kids under 10, and that he'd been wearing reading glasses during paperwork, which he denied every time I mentioned it. She asked about the apartment. I told her I'd bought curtains, real ones, not the sheet I'd pinned up the first week, and that the bedroom window faced east, so I woke up with light on my face every morning, and I hadn't decided yet if I loved that or hated it. You love it, she said. She was probably right. The conversation slowed the way good ones do, not running out of things to say, but settling into the spaces between them. She stirred her cortado with a tiny spoon and looked at me, and I realized this was the first friendship I'd built that Corbin had never touched. He didn't know this version of me. He didn't know the woman who picked her own mugs and laughed at dog videos and drank black coffee across from someone who understood without needing to be told. I set my cup down. I never said this right, I told her. But what you did in that courtroom, I don't know how to thank someone for that. She didn't look away, but she didn't make it heavy either. She just shrugged one shoulder, the way she did when something mattered more than she wanted to show. You don't have to, she said. I was the person nobody believed. I wasn't going to let it happen twice. She said it like it was simple. Maybe it was. Maybe the bravest things are just decisions that refuse to stay complicated. We split the check. We walked out into the February sun, and the air was cool but not bitter. The kind of late winter afternoon that promises something without naming it. Dagny stopped on the sidewalk and turned to me. Have you ever thought about going back to your father's dojo? She asked. Not to train, to teach. I hadn't thought about it, but the moment she said it, I couldn't stop. The idea didn't leave. It sat with me through the rest of February, quiet and patient, like it had been waiting for Dagny to say it out loud. I called my father on a Tuesday night and told him I wanted to help with the women's self-defense class. He was silent for 3 seconds. Then he said, Saturday, 10 o'clock, don't be late. The girl was 14, left-handed, and she kept dropping her elbow the same way I did at 8. I saw it from across the mat the moment the drill started, that slight collapse at the joint, the wrist rolling inward instead of locking flat. I crossed the room before I'd decided to move. Here, I said, kneeling beside her. I took her forearm gently and rotated it until the bones stacked. Feel that? That's where the leverage lives. You don't need to be stronger than the other person. You just need this angle. She tried it again. The lock caught. Her eyes went wide. Good, I said. Now do it again until your body stops asking your brain for permission. I stood up and caught my father watching from the edge of the mat. He had his arms folded and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I recognized that look. It was the same one he'd given me 20 years ago when I'd landed my first clean hold on the heavy bag and turned to see if he'd noticed. He had noticed then. He was noticing now. The class ran 90 minutes. 12 women, ages ranging from a college freshman to a grandmother who told me she'd been mugged outside a Piggly Wiggly in 1998 and had been angry about it ever since. I showed them escapes, wrist releases, how to use a hip turn to break someone's grip. The moves were simple. The room smelled like vinyl mats and sweat and the faint pine of the cleaning solution Dad mopped with every morning. You think strength is the thing that saves you. It's not. It's the thing someone plants in you long before you know you'll need it. A hold taught at age 8. A question asked in a parking lot. A father who sees the bruise before it forms. After class, the women filtered out in 2s and 3s, talking and laughing, rolling their shoulders. The college freshman asked if I'd be back next week. I told her I would. The grandmother squeezed my hand at the door and said, You're good at this, honey. Her grip was firm. I believed her. Dad swept the mat while I wiped down the mirrors. We worked in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't need filling. The fluorescent lights hummed. Through the front window, I could see the parking lot, the bare crepe myrtles lining the curb, the pale March sky that couldn't decide between clouds and blue. You teach it better than I do, he said, not looking up from the broom. I stopped wiping. That's not true. It is, he said. You teach it like someone who's used it. He paused. The broom stilled. That's different from someone who just knows it. When did I stop being the woman who survived Corbin Hewitt and start being the woman who teaches other women how to stand? I don't think there was a single moment. I think it happened in layers, the apartment, the curtains, the coffee with Dagny, the morning light I'd decided I loved after all. Each one ordinary, each one mine. Dad leaned the broom against the wall and sat on the bench by the door. I sat next to him. The bench was wooden, smooth from years of use, and it creaked the way it always had. I could taste the metallic edge of exertion at the back of my throat. My hands were warm from the mirror cleaner. "Dad," I said, "when you taught me that hold I was 8. Why that young?" He looked at the mat, not at me. "Because I couldn't teach you any younger." The answer landed in my chest and stayed there. He hadn't been preparing me for strangers. He'd been preparing me for whoever walked through my door. And he'd known, maybe not consciously, maybe just in the way fathers know that the danger wouldn't always come from outside. A dojo is just a room with mats on the floor. But some rooms hold every version of you, the child who learned to lock her wrist, the wife who forgot she knew how, the woman who walked out, and the one who walked back in to teach someone else. I helped him lock up. We walked to the parking lot together, and the March air was cool on my face, carrying the faint salt smell that drifts inland from the harbor when the wind is right. His lesson was 20 years old. My freedom was 8 months old, and the woman I was becoming had no expiration date. He hugged me before I got in my car. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Surviving something doesn't mean you deserved it, and the people who love you best sometimes show it years before you understand why. I spent 3 days married to a man who thought control was the same as love. I ignored a warning from the person who knew me best. I smiled through a wedding I should have walked away from because I wanted to believe people could change. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait for the person hurting you to become the person you fell in love with. That version never existed. This wasn't just a revenge story about a woman getting even. It was a revenge story about a woman getting free. There's a difference. Revenge doesn't have to mean destruction. Sometimes it means building a life so whole that the person who tried to break you becomes irrelevant. I believe God put me through those months for a reason, not to suffer, but to teach. To stand on my father's mat and show other women that the hold someone puts on your life can be broken with the right angle and the right people beside you. That's the real revenge story, not what I did to him, but what I became without him. If any part of this reached you today, leave me a comment and tell me which moment hit the hardest. Was it the courtroom? The dojo? The silence in that empty apartment? I want to hear your answer. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some details in this story were adjusted for narrative and emotional impact. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental. The heart of it, the message, is what I hope walks out of here with you.